Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to this session, which is called Exploring Community Trust in News. I'm glad that it's called Exploring Community Trust in News and not resolving all the problems of community trust in news, because we've only got 45 minutes. But we have an absolutely fantastic panel, and we're also joined by a Facebook Live audience as well, and we'll be taking questions both from people in the room and from them in a little while. So I'd just like to introduce the panel before we go any further. And we were discussing a little bit before we came on how, in a way, this kind of whole question and the news system is a little bit like an ecosystem with different parts. And I guess, using that metaphor, we have different parts of that ecosystem represented here on the platform. So from the technology platform perspective, Anya Kerr, at the end of the row there, leads journalism partnerships at Facebook, may well need no further introduction to anyone from this city, Dublin, or who's been here since the start of the day, because of course Facebook is hosting this event. So Anya is with the team that's focused on building products, tools and services for journalists and improving news literacy for news consumers. Anya spent 5 years at Storyful, the social media news agency, and prior to that worked for some years as a political correspondent and news reporter on the Irish Times, Irish Independent, Irish Examiner. So really solid journalistic track record as well as platform expertise. To my right here we have Claire Wardle, who I guess I'm going to say is our representative from the world of the non-profits and academia, because Claire is currently research director at First Draft, which is a non-profit dedicated to finding solutions to the challenges around trust and truth. But Claire was previously the research director at the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia, and prior to that was also at Storyful, I think, at some point. So there's a theme emerging here. Yeah. And then last but by no means least, Mark Frankel, a colleague of mine from BBC News. Mark is responsible for the BBC News social media and user-generated content output and strategy, and oversees some of the BBC's most popular social media accounts. And I think it's probably true to say that the Facebook page for BBC News is the biggest of any news organisation currently, is that right?
That's right.
And you oversee that and the team that runs it. So as I say, great panel. And I wanted to kick off, actually, by doing something which Claire urged us to do before, or me in particular to do, which was to do a bit of homework. Because actually what Claire was saying was that there has been a huge amount of discussion, debate and study and research about the subject of trust in the media and about so-called fake news or false news. And so rather than just kind of starting from scratch, why don't we just pick out a few of the key findings and facts and insights that we've had so far. So with a bit of help from pointers from Claire, I'm just gonna go through a few key facts and quotes, insights, just to sort of set the scene. So one of the links that Claire sent was a great report, which if you haven't seen it, I urge you to have a look at, from the Shorenstein Centre, which is about combating fake news. That came out a few weeks ago, and a couple of things that they point out. First of all, they define the problem quite neatly, I think. So in a number of ways, they say news channels of distribution have been developing faster than our abilities to understand or stabilize them. They've got a great quote near the beginning of their summary paper, which goes as follows: "Once the news faker obtains access to the press wires, all the honest editors alive won't be able to repair the mischief he can do. An editor receiving a news item over the wire has no opportunity to test its authenticity. The offices of the members of the AP in this country are connected with one another. Its centres of news gathering and distribution by telegraph wires could extend 5 times around the globe. This is a very sensitive organism." So this was a piece from the Harper's Magazine in 1925 entitled "Fake News and the Public." So this is not a new problem we're facing, but there is new technology which is bringing new aspects to it. So Shorenstein also say, "Misinformation amplified by new technological means poses a threat to open societies worldwide." I think that's kind of a neat way of encapsulating it. It talks about social media systems providing fertile ground for the spread of misinformation. particularly dangerous for political debate in a democratic society. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that played out in the French elections in a minute. We've obviously had the US elections to talk about too. They put their own definition on filter bubbles or echo chambers, which is, quote, the tendency of people to follow like-minded people leads to the creation of these echo chambers and filter bubbles, which exacerbate polarization. So that's kind of defining the problem. And if I may, just a few points from a couple of other reports. One is the Reuters Institute Digital News Report from last year. I know there's a new one coming out shortly. They also looked at the question of trust in news. So a few key points from that report. And again, if you haven't seen it, it's worth delving into that. Across 26 countries, the picture of trust in news is by no means uniform. So typically affluent Western European, Scandinavian countries, which have a mix of strong, well-funded public service broadcasters and commercial players, score relatively highly for trust. It's lower in the US and much lower in Southern European countries, and Greece actually came bottom of the table in their survey in terms of trust in media. So not a uniform picture. Other insights, half of those surveyed said they use social media as a source of news each week. No big surprise there. However, many of those people who are looking at news brands don't necessarily notice the news brand on social media. Again, that's something that you will be well aware of if you're working for a news organization, that concern. But one of the key findings of the Reuters report was that their research suggests that even in the era of social media and the atomization that happens around the news kind of ecosystem, traditional news brands still matter enormously, and I'd like to come back to that. And one last point, and then I really genuinely will ask a question. So trust in news, well, actually trust generally seems to be on the wane in many respects. So there was a really interesting report came out at the beginning of the year from Edelman, the big PR firm. It's UK specific, but still it's interesting. Says trust in the British government that was already low at 36% is now down to 26%. The number of people in the UK saying they trust the media fell from 36% in 2016 to 24%. And in terms of institutions, like who do people trust, 18% of respondents to the Edelman survey said they trusted political parties in general, 18%, not very high, as you might expect, that they trust political parties to do what's right, 19% for political leaders, 27% for the EU, 55% for the British people, and top was 88% for family. So I think that's kind of interesting too in the context of social and platforms and who you get your news from. So before the panel, one person described what we're facing as systemic failure. Anya, I'll go to you first. Shouldn't Facebook be able to just fix this with your algorithmic powers and, you know, just do a bit of tweaking and you can just get rid of the fake news?
Well, it's something we've been working on for a very long time. And when we think about false news and you're thinking about trusting communities, I think it's so much more complex and diverse than just false news. This is about misinformation, it's about spam content, it's about a lot of folks masquerading as legitimate publishers and just trying to kind of sow chaos and confusion. So it is a very complex field that you're dealing with. And like I would say, of the 400 odd million links that are shared every week on Facebook, large parts of that, it's quality journalism, it's great stories and anecdotes being shared by friends and family. But of course, there are bad actors on Facebook who are trying to use the platform to make money, to monetize. And that's one of the things that we have learned on Facebook, is that a lot of these bad actors are financially motivated. But stepping back from this for just a moment in terms of where Facebook comes from and why we take misinformation, false news, etc. so seriously, is that core to the mission of Facebook is this idea of making the world more open and connected. And about 4 or 5 weeks ago, you may have seen that Mark Zuckerberg published this 6,000-word letter. It was a community letter in which he talks about this concept of an open, connected world. But there was a key phrase in there that he had started to use, which is this concept of informed communities, building informed communities. Now, if you're going to build informed communities through Facebook, you need a strong news industry. And so all of you who go on the newsfeed day to day, what newsfeed is trying to do is ultimately amplify the good effects and mitigate the bad. So we have been tackling this from a number of approaches when it comes to false news and misinformation and spam, etc. And it ultimately comes down to 3 areas, and we can go into it in more detail later. But first and foremost is disrupting those economic incentives that I mentioned, because again, a lot of these bad actors, that's what they're motivated by. So we've built, machine learning to detect the patterns around these inauthentic accounts and take action. And secondly, to have early detection of fake inauthentic accounts. So therefore, these guys who are masquerading as legitimate publishers, and we've seen them do it, like it's so simple sometimes, it's like abc.co.com, so it looks to the eye very quickly, this is a legitimate publisher, and they're trying to come to Facebook, build traffic there, bring you back, but the website, it's often fake content and it's a lot of ads. So disrupting that link between Facebook and these spoof domains, these inauthentic accounts. So that's first and foremost. The second thing that we've been doing, a lot of experimentation around this.
Can I just interrupt just for one second, just for clarification? So in terms of intervening there around those fake sites, and is that done technically or editorially by people?
So mixture of machine learning, early detection using technology. We also have a community standards team. Currently that team is made up of about 4,500 people worldwide. We're adding another 3,000 people to that team over the next year. So that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is an experiment we've been doing in the US and France using third-party fact-checking organizations. So in the US, it's been ABC, Snopes, PolitiFact, and 2 others. And in that case, and we can go into this in more detail, but where those third-party fact-checking organizations have put a flag to say, this is worse of the worst hoax, disputed it, you cannot then monetize that content. It gets downranked in newsfeed, can't make money of it, can't put ads on it. So that's the whole first area of monetization. The second one is ultimately then building products so that people will share less fake, false, misinformation content. And that spreads a variety of areas, making it easier for the community of nearly 2 billion people to flag what they believe is spam or false content. Also this idea of informed sharing. We do a lot of analysis every day. If a lot of people are clicking into an article, reading it or doing something in there to engage with it, but not sharing it, that's a signal again to the newsfeed to say something isn't right here. So again, there's ranking going on, mitigating the bad to amplify the good. A lot of other experimentation we're doing is around polarization. Like, yes, you can tackle false news in these ways, but also kind of thinking about how do you give people more perspectives on Facebook? Because we've all talked about, filter bubbles and polarization. So we've been doing some interesting experimentation around perspectives-related articles. Can come back to that later. And then thirdly, is thinking about, okay, we have a responsibility on Facebook to address this problem, but also work with the industry, and particularly around thinking about how do we give the audience the skills and tools and information they need to be their own arbiters of truth and figure out what's real and what's fake, what to trust and what not to trust. And so we're doing a lot of work around news literacy initiatives. We've established the News Integrity Initiative, which we can go into later, in terms of how do we kind of get that duality between a technological fix, but also empowering the community at large to really collaborate amongst themselves to call out and debunk what's real or what's fake.
Okay. Thanks very much. So that's very clearly articulated sort of 3 key areas that you're taking action in and looking to focus on. We'll come back to them in a minute, but can I just go to Claire next? So Claire, I think you've got some fresh experience from looking at fact-checking and just kind of generally looking at misleading narratives around the French elections, and I wonder if there's a kind of any fresh insight you can bring. I know, Mark, some of your team were involved in that, some of mine as well, but tell us where that ended up, how that went.
So we have a global partner network, and back in November, a number of European partners said we're worried about the French election. So in January, we had a meeting in Paris with 40 French newsrooms to say, is there anything that we could do here? And some British ones. Mark came over on the Eurostar. And we decided to build Crosscheck France, which was an experiment. I'd been sitting on all of these different panels. I felt like we weren't doing anything, we weren't getting new data. So we basically created a project where we were monitoring using tools like NewsWhip and CrowdTangle and Google Trends to say, what's surfacing around the French election that looks potentially problematic. And we also had questions coming in from the audience using Hearken. And it was a mixture of fact checks. People wanted to know whether Marine Le Pen really said that, as well as manipulated photos, imposter content. And the idea was that it would be flagged, or we would see it, and then there would be collaborative verification amongst the different newsrooms, which I don't think we realized was going to be such a heavy lift. But there was incredible Slack conversations, too many Slack conversations. And then at the end, there was a writing up of the story. So as a researcher, I'm really pleased that we did it, but we now need to research, did we do more harm than good? The visual flags that we used, was that helpful to the audience? Was it helpful for the audience to have different logos from different French newsrooms? Or did it look like the media conspiracy conspiring against this? People shared in very large numbers on Facebook, but we need to look at the comments. We had people posting not very nice things about us. We had lots of happy reactions, lots of angry face reactions. There's oodles of data now for us to look at to help the industry as a whole to say, how do we do this? But I'd say one thing as an industry is this is a new type of journalism. Previously, if something was false, we could all say, well, we'd have to bother. Now, the audience is looking for help navigating that. But we would see, for example, one example we use a lot is an imposter content site that looked like Le Soir from Belgium, and it was saying that Saudi Arabia was funding Macron. Very sophisticated, but we saw it sitting very much in some certain Facebook groups, and it wasn't really traveling. We thought, if we debunk that, we're giving oxygen to a story that should not be given oxygen. However, at one point, Marine Le Pen's niece, tweeted that story, so we saw it shift out of those Facebook groups and move mainstream. And at that point, we were able to debunk relatively quickly. So for us, that was a really important learning to say, did we stop misinformation? We did see stuff come down. We did seem to think that there was use to the project, but I don't want to replicate that in other countries until we know whether it's been helpful.
So can I just pick on something you said, which was really interesting, which was did we do more harm than good? Do you mean that there's a risk that by flagging instances of incorrect stories that have been put out there for ulterior motives, you're drawing more attention to them and creating a kind of a more of a buzz around them? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of research done around the effectiveness of fact-checking. A lot of it is experimental, so it's in a lab, mostly with American undergraduates. And there's this fear of the backfire effect, which is when you label something, you're actually causing more people to run towards it. And in the same way as we have to be careful about how we phrase debunk. So a classic 5 myths about vaccination. False, 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 false. And we list the myths. Our brain remembers the myths, not the fact that it's false. Our brains are very lazy, and in order to have something debunked by our brains, we have to, for a very brief moment, believe the false information. So as an industry, we also have to learn, how do we change the narrative? So rather than simply saying, by pushing more informed information out into the community, we're helping, we actually need to replace the false narrative with a new narrative, because narrative is what's worked. Conspiracies work because it's a story. It's a compelling, simple story. The idea that we write complicated 800-word fact checks and think that that's going to change the world is not working. So the reason that we need more data is that we need to understand how do we do this effectively and not just believe that, by pushing better quality information out there, we're going to do what we want to do. And that in itself can be problematic.
So not only is there a potential issue in drawing attention to those stories, but actually if you go out and do an outright, rebuttal and disprove it, then that actually may reinforce
exactly
people's belief in the original story.
Yes.
Okay, so
it's not easy.
So then, Mark, as a practitioner of news stories, do you agree, first of all, with Claire's assertion that people are looking for help in understanding, what to believe and what not to believe, and where the authentic sources are and what the right narrative is? Is that your experience? And also, I guess to be provocative to you, could we not just say, if you were doing a better job of getting those key bits of, say, BBC News content out in a really shareable way, then that would conquer all, and you wouldn't have to worry about the other stuff?
Well, let me deal with the second part first, because I think I'd agree with pretty much everything that Claire said about the challenge and the issues that we all face. But the amplification of the good is part of the problem that we all face. I think it's fantastic that Facebook are looking at this in a serious way and trying to do all the news literacy that Anya has described. I think it's great that there are programs that Claire and others have been involved in to spread that understanding and that literacy. The difficulty is that if my team at the BBC work on a reality check piece, and we've got a new department that we created around that kind of fact-checking operation, and we post that content onto Facebook or onto any other social media platform, is it going to get shared? Is it going to get the same amount of eyeballs?
And what's
that
the answer?
a fake?
So you're asking that as a rhetorical question. You probably know the answer.
We know. I mean, I can tell you that it won't get the volume of. It is a rhetorical question, and the answer is no, frankly. And that is, I think amplification of the good, to come back to what Oni was saying earlier, is part of the challenge here. It's not just, the flagging of the bad. And I think there's also a real challenge to us all in terms of the willingness of our audiences, readers, listeners, whoever they might be, dependent on the publisher and the broadcaster, to actually want to engage in the kind of things that we're serving them. Because as Claire says, they have lazy brains. We all have lazy brains, frankly. I've been talking to people earlier today. The Daily Mail. I love reading the Daily Mail. But I don't necessarily believe everything I read in the Daily Mail, but I still read the Daily Mail. Why do I read it? Because I enjoy reading it. There is an ecosystem on Facebook and on lots of other platforms that people are drawn to that has nothing to do with what is true or false. It's to do with what they are drawn to instinctively, what they enjoy spending time on, what they want to encourage other people to look at. And I think there's a big challenge here. I think the other thing I'd say about all of this is that I think we have a tendency to exaggerate the problem or to frame it in the wrong way. I think there is a problem with fake news. There is clearly a problem with particular kinds of news and their propensity to be seen in different ways. But I think there's a bigger problem with hyper-partisan sites pushing that kind of agenda in different ways. And actually the volume, the total volume of fake news in any given news feed is actually relatively small. It troubles us.
I think
as
Facebook would bear that out, wouldn't
it troubles us as journalists actually more than it troubles the general public. And actually there is a challenge for us to be able to educate and inform people about the problem without at the same time over magnifying it. Because the danger is that people then have a problem with the social media companies. They start to mistrust the ecosystem of social media more generally. So I think there's a tricky balancing act here, and I'm not sure that we have all the answers.
But I'd like to come back. Thank you. I'd like to come back to that question which Claire posed, which is people are looking to us for help in understanding what to believe and what not to believe. The implication of what you're saying, I think, is that actually maybe not so much, because actually people enjoy the content and they can make their own judgments or not, as the case may be, and actually they're not looking out for a handy guide to 5 ways to spot something that isn't true, or maybe they don't even want to break out of to use the kind of slightly cliched term now, the filter bubble, and they're quite happy to keep consuming the same kinds of stories that reinforce their worldview. So maybe to sort of quote you back to yourself, it's a problem that we feel is a really big problem, but maybe users more widely don't. And what's your perspective on that, Anya? The media literacy initiative that Facebook is involved with, how is that working, and what kind of demand do you see for that from people?
Yeah, and to pick up on some of the things that Claire and Mark raised, like the one thing I would just want to spell out is that we do not want to see false news on our platform, nor do our users. And we've seen already the complexities of this, and we're very much committed to working on this until we get it right. Because again, wanting to amplify that informative content. And to your point about news literacy, back to that idea, if you're going to amplify good effects and create a demand, like I think probably we all think every day about the supply of journalism, and how do we think about the demand for that quality journalism, that informative content. So we've been doing some interesting experiments in recent weeks where at the very top of newsfeed in about 14 countries, we've been running what we call public service announcements, so PSAs. And when you clicked into it at the very top of your newsfeed, you saw 10 tips, tricks, best practices on how to identify false news, fake content, hoaxes, etc. And we're doing some research to really understand how How helpful has that been? How meaningful has that been? Then with the News Integrity Initiative, which we announced probably about 5 weeks ago at this stage, it's a $14 million fund. There's about 25 early funders and participants involved to really try and organise a lot of events, fund research and fund projects. And Claire can speak to this, but really trying to kind of get to grips with applied research and understand what would actually be meaningful in terms of rebuilding trust, creating that sense of demand. What is it that the community really needs right now, as opposed to making assumptions? So there's a job of research that this News Integrity Initiative really needs to do around this to help things. And to the points that we raised earlier about the flagging of content, so the experiment that we have been doing in US and France with third-party fact-checking organizations, very quickly to explain it, was that we created this queue, this line, or as you might say in the US, where if the community come in, on your drop-down right-hand side of your newsfeed, you'll always see a little grey arrow. And when you clicked in there, you could say, I want to report this article as spam or as false news. And you were asked a reason, and you could say, I just don't believe it should be on Facebook. I want somebody to take a look. Where they clicked, I believe this is hoax or this is false news, it got sent across to this queue. There's a full-time team of researchers on Facebook who would just quickly look at the domain to see, is this a personal post or is this potentially a spoof domain? Where it was potentially one of those spoof domains, it went across to the third-party fact-checking organizations who had to be previously signed up to the Pointer Principles Protocol. So they all had kind of gold standards of how they went around their business of verifying and debunking content. If and when two or more flagged it, a flag went in it saying this is being disputed by third-party fact-checking organizations. They attached one of their articles to give what they believed was the factual position. Where that happened, it got downranked in Facebook. You couldn't monetize it. Now, there's obviously, as Claire has alluded to, questions over is that helpful or not? We're still analysing it. We feel this has definitely been helpful, and that definitely people have shared less of that disputed content, but it hasn't been perfect.
Okay.
And
Thanks for
there's
explaining.
definitely iteration and learning that has to happen on our part as well.
Thank you
with
for
that.
explaining the methodology, because I'm not sure everyone's familiar with that, so that's good to know. I think, Mark, you wanted to come back on?
Because it's fantastic that there's that ecosystem to check it, but what happens when somebody goes, fantastic, you've pointed out something that's fake, and now we want to encourage people to share it even more? We've seen already that system is gamed quite easily.
Yeah.
And there's been quite a lot written about this recently, that actually in pointing out the fakery, it then becomes almost like sort of red rag to a bull to all those hyper-partisan groups that are thinking, hey, this is like a label of, badge of honor. I've been given a flag here.
Yeah, it's not a perfect system. We would say that if it has been disputed and flagged, you are less likely to see it in feed because it is going to be downranked potentially by newsfeed algorithms. So our early analysis shows that
it's already
disputed.
after it's gone.
Yeah, there's definitely that point in time between it coming into a third-party fact checker, then putting the flag, and then that signalling, and that's why I don't think the solutions that we're discussing today, it can't be just this, which is to Claire's other point about is flags enough? We would say no. That's why we're thinking about polarization and sensationalism and clickbait and all of these other things. Because to Claire's point, there is no, a lot of the research and evidence would suggest that if you simply show a person one alternative point of view, so you read something that maybe confirmed your bias, you then saw one alternative point of view from Snopes or PolitiFact or whoever, the research suggests you're actually more likely to become more entrenched in that original viewpoint. So we've been doing 2 experiments in recent weeks. In France, we ran what we call perspectives. So if you read a story that had a civic activity mentioned and a presidential candidate, you got served up these range of perspectives. So let's say it was energy or that you had clicked into. You then saw a range of perspectives that showed where all of the political candidates stood on that. So that's been one interesting perspective. The other that we've done is been around related articles. So a lot of you are used to the concept of clicking in, reading an article, and then seeing suggested articles to give you a spectrum of opinions. What we've been doing in recent weeks is before you read that article around a big hot
You
topic,
get some recommendations.
you get it before
Yeah.
you read in to see where are you already in
Yeah.
your spectrum of ideas, so that there are maybe 5 point of views being suggested to you under the shelf of
Okay.
that article. So I think that's why we have to come at it from a range and diverse suite of options.
And it sounds as though it's always going to be a moving target as well. I want to bring in some questions from the floor and from anyone on Facebook Live that wants to pose any questions in just a second. I just want to ask one more myself, which is kind of to follow on really from what you've been talking about, Anya, and what you've mentioned, Claire. So you've talked about research in the context of media literacy and understanding how people, what they're looking for. So in other words, do people want help with anything, and what is it in understanding that? So from the research community, Claire, do you feel that you're getting the engagement you need from Facebook and from the other platforms in terms of the data and the kind of the chance to jump in and try and figure out this kind of challenge together, or not? Or does it feel like the platforms are doing it for themselves and you're kind of on the outside looking in? I'm just curious to know how that.
No, I mean, I think there's a recognition now that this is a problem that we're not going to get out of for decades. And so when you look at, I mean, as we know, this is not a new problem. Donald Trump's election forced people to wake up to an issue that has actually been, people globally have been much more aware of it. I'd say that we are having, I think the ecosystem of newsrooms, non-profits, academics, platforms, increasingly governments want to get into this space. We can only going to solve this if we actually talk to one another. I think we all agree we would love more access to Facebook data. We also have to recognise they're a commercial company. It's hard for me to get BBC data. So there is an issue around that.
Talk to you afterwards.
Yeah. But I think if we are serious about solving it, we do, all of us would say, we've all, everybody's got a piece of the ecosystem, and we do need access to better data.
Okay, thank you. So are there any questions from the floor? Does anyone want to ask anything, or just say anything to add to the discussion? Yeah, gentleman over there on the end of the row.
Hi, my name's Shannon. I'm with Vettage, based in Philadelphia. Question really quick. Have any of you dealt with super nerdy name, Interplanetary File System, or IPFS? It's a content registry, kind of blockchain based. I don't know if anybody has looked into this.
Mark, you were nodding.
Well, I've heard of it. When you say I've heard of it, but we haven't had any direct dealings with it. No. So, have you?
No.
No.
Sounds amazing. I
Yeah.
mean, blockchain is the answer to everything, as we know, and has been discussed for the last 5 years as the answer to everything. I would love to see, and maybe you work for a company that, great. So
Sounds
we'll
like
talk
there's
to
a
you
discussion
afterwards.
to have
Yes.
afterwards.
Yeah.
Yep.
But
Okay.
we just need as much help as we can. And
So Anya making a note as well.
Yeah.
So to be followed up.
Yeah.
Any others? Yeah.
Just a quick one on the filter bubble. You said fake news is not a new thing, which it isn't. Surely the filter bubble position was there before. You could change the television station to the one you wanted to hear, and in which case, what's different now?
can I answer that? Just the scale. So I grew up, social worker parents, friends, academics, read The Guardian cover to cover and the BBC. I was definitely in my own echo chamber. We now, for the UK election, are monitoring all of this stuff. When you look at the hyper-partisan sites and the speed at which this stuff can move, and the real sophistication of those groups and how much you can have echo chambers about one particular topic and people are really active around that. I think it's the same with all of this. It's existed, but the speed at which this stuff spreads and the trusted peer-to-peer stuff. So those echo chambers of people who actually don't know each other in real life, but yet the connections they feel to each other and the trust they feel because they're all in the same Facebook group weirdly mimics the echo chambers of my family and friends. And I think trying to understand that and recognizing that it's not new, but what does it look like when the technology is kind of supercharging what we've always been likely to do?
I just sort of add very, very quickly that there's also a lot of targeted ads in this
Yes.
space as well. We haven't talked about that, but if you are in one constituency, your UK elections going on at the moment, you're in a marginal constituency, you are going to see ads of a different kind and sort and focus than people in another part of the country. And there's a huge sophistication around this at the moment. A lot of focus on this as a subject in its own right. And if you ally to that the organisation of the various campaigning groups on Facebook and other platforms to try and push their particular agendas to you, you're also seeing yet more evidence of a filter bubble.
I would add a third thing in, which is kind of obvious, I guess, but just if you're talking about broadcast, because you mentioned watching the TV bulletins at home, so they certainly in the UK and many countries they are regulated by a broadcasting code, which does govern aspects of impartiality and balance and things, particularly in election periods. So that's a framework that's in place there that isn't here. Do we have a Facebook question? Facebook Live question?
Yeah, thanks,
Adam.
Steve. So this question comes from Stephanie at 10 TV in Columbus, Ohio, USA. And the question is, if trusted news is a supply and demand problem, are we largely addressing the supply? And how do we, as a news community, address the demand?
That's a great question. Anyone feel like taking that one? I mean, the demand... Okay, let's go to Anya, then Mark.
Yeah, so we back in March, Facebook with Arizona State University organised a weekend working group, brought people from all over the world from various different sectors, universities, third-party organisations, people who've been thinking about news literacy, informed communities for decades. And that weekend told us 4 or 5 things. One was the need for this coalition and funding, which we did. The second was for a more coordinated effort around education initiatives in schools. So particularly in the United States, there's a lot of initiatives around news literacy projects. Stony Brook and the likes have built curricula and also built e-learning courses, which if you go online, you can see them, and they're providing them for free to, I think now they're up to like 60 countries around the world have come to them in recent months to access these free courses. And then there's been this question of literacy more generally. And I think one of the questions that was left unanswered from that weekend was, how do you make news literacy part of a newsroom ethos? Because like newsrooms have policies and procedures and guidelines around everything, but very often it's maybe not the first thing that you think about as well, in terms of every day you're writing headlines and articles thinking about the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, how, why. But how do you actually start to kind of ingrain news literacy in terms of what
So you mean,
newsrooms do?
how do you encourage journalists to think about how they can help audiences understand what to look out for and that sort of thing in the course of the normal day-to-day reporting?
Yeah, and that's been a question that has come back. It's been really interesting the last 4 weeks with News Integrity Initiative, is that open question of how do you do more inside-out journalism, something that Storyful and others do really, really well, I guess, for their
So that's
partners.
in part sort of unpicking the process of the news and helping people understand how you piece together the information and how you gather it, and that sort of thing, do you mean?
Yeah, and like I think one of the asks that we've had from publishers, we've been doing a lot of roundtables and work streams in the last few months as part of the Facebook Journalism Project, is that question of, can Facebook maybe show more context around a story, so that every time you come into an article, maybe you're going to see 3 data points that show you, is this a publisher that was set up just last week, or is this somebody who's been in the business for years? Do they have the blue tick? Like, what are some of the things that will help somebody with their
and the
own
related articles thing that you mentioned as well?
Yeah.
But
Mark,
I think the supply and
what's your
demand question is really interesting, especially when it comes to social media, because I know with the UK election, there are a lot of people who are interested and a huge number of people who are not interested. I also know that I work for a public service organisation where we have an obligation to bring the subject to the widest possible audience.
And you say not interested in
in
media
this
literacy as a...
election process,
Right.
the topics, the subjects, anything about it, they may just not be interested.
Okay.
But I have an obligation working for an organisation like the BBC to try and
Interest them.
encourage them to be
Yeah.
interested. There then comes a question in my head. I can present things in different ways on social media platforms that doesn't, I'm not looking to distort anything, but I'm looking to present different episodes of the election. It could be an altercation between a politician and a member of the public. It could be a series of policy objectives with snazzy graphics associated with it. In one sense, what I'm doing is all about literacy. In another, it's all about presentation. And I think the difficulty is that there's a demand from a social media perspective on things that are shareable and things that provoke conversation. And there isn't always a collision between what is shareable and what provokes conversation and what is genuinely informative and educational. And that is a big, big challenge for news organisations, particularly on social media.
That's a kind of a massive editorial challenge and a creative challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think we've got time for possibly one more question. Do we have somebody been waiting patiently there?
Hi.
Yes, it is.
Diana from Opinory. I have a question in terms of the feed is called Newsfeed, and I think this name is a bit misleading in the sense that it blurs the subjective and the objective, because this is where you see information from your peers, which is subject to interpretation, but then you also have serious stories, which are objective, that can't be challenged. So my question is, and maybe it's a bit idealistic, why not separate the two? Why not leave, you know, the social information that you get from your peers on one side, and then the objective information on the other side, and then you won't have this sort of double or second guessing everything that you see because you have access to so much subjective information.
The mixing together. I mean, so that's clearly a question for Anya, so we'll probably let Anya have the last word in that case. But for anyone who was at the previous session about the lock screen as the home screen and the kind of the type of content that comes in there, that's absolutely a mix of the personal, the family, you know, the news, the official. So similar kind of thing going on. But what's your response to that? Newsfeed as a name, is that misleading?
Yeah, great question. I would say, first and foremost, with Newsfeed, there's a set of values that lie behind it. And first and foremost is that Newsfeed should be a place that you come to engage with your friends and family. And there are 5, 6 values. You can, if you go and Google them, you'll find them. But the second one, the value that sits behind Newsfeed, is that Newsfeed should be a place that you come to be informed. And the reason that we have that so high up there is that all of the research that we've done, we have this Newsfeed quality program who day in, day out are doing surveys with the community, and they're asked all the time, why do you come to Newsfeed? And the first thing they say is that they come to connect with their friends and family, so to be connected. Second one is to be entertained and engaged. And the third one is to be informed. That's what they want from Newsfeed, are those 3 things. And we've done a lot of experimentation where we've separated things out. We've done the showing things in chronological order. And all the research that comes back to it, people want the 2 things together. They want their diet of the friends and family and the informative content. But that's not to say that we won't continue to experiment and test it and learn from community. But that's the key thing, is all the time asking our almost 2 billion people, how would you like to see this set up? And how is it engaging and informative to you? But it's a great question, and definitely one that comes up and we'll continue to test on.
That's great, thank you. I think we're out of time. Trevor has given us our warning, and I know that the feed is due to wind up as well. So thank you all very much for the questions and for listening, and to anyone who joins us on Facebook Live as well.
Thank
All
you.
right,
Thank
yeah,
you.
thanks so much to our great panelists.
Thank you.
Just a reminder, we had some demos going on. We've got Chartbeat, Destiny at Google, all kinds of cool groups. The group that's in there now is going to hang out till 2, so if you need a stretch and you want to go check those out, now is a great time to do that. And I think Google and a couple of others start in at around 2, so be sure to check those out. Thanks, everyone.